Okay, so Reconstruction. We are done with the Civil War, and we are going to look at what's going on in the South after the Civil War and how the South is going to rebuild. So, what are we reconstructing? We're reconstructing the Southern economic system, which was not only affected by the loss of slavery, but also heavily impacted by the destruction of infrastructure during the Civil War. We are reconstructing Southern politics, again, impacted by the loss of slavery and that identity of what Southern politics are, the conversation of states' rights versus the control of the federal government, right? Big government versus small government, federal government versus state government. And then we're also, as I mentioned, literally rebuilding the South. Railroads are a big example of that. So, after the war, about 3.5 million slaves are freed. So, now what? These freed slaves have no money, they have no property, and they have nowhere to go. Questions that we're grappling with as a country during Reconstruction. What is real freedom? Is it land? Do they get property? Is it legal equality? Should there be congressional amendments, or is that already covered? How much should the South have to agree to certain terms in order to move forward? So, whites in the South want to return to antebellum life. They want regional autonomy. They want a continuation of white supremacy. They want slaves, but if they can't have slaves, they want these freed slaves to be subjugated in similar ways as they were pre-Civil War. What role does the federal government have to play? Does the federal government actually go into the South and help pay to rebuild infrastructure? And what is the goal of the military presence in the South to protect free blacks? Is it going to be enough? What is the federal government going to be doing in order to try to rebuild the South and to protect the new rights of these newly freed slaves? So there are a couple of different plans for Reconstruction. This is Lincoln's plan. It's a 10% plan. It's a very lenient Reconstruction policy. Essentially, it gives general amnesty to white Southerners. There are some exceptions if you were in leadership. It requires an oath of loyalty to the government. 10% of the state's population had to take that loyalty oath to be admitted. It required the acceptance of the abolition of slavery in state constitutions. And it wants to extend suffrage or voting rights to educated blacks who owned property or who had served in the Union Army. By 1864, 3 Southern states have loyal governments in place with new state constitutions: Louisiana, Arkansas, and Tennessee. Radical Republicans, they want total abolition of slavery. They want to protect black civil rights. They want to take property from white Southerners and give that land to blacks. Conservative Republicans called for only abolition of slavery. They didn't think that there should be any kind of loyalty oath, suffrage requirements, or anything like that. They just wanted the abolition of slavery, and that was all. Radical Republicans are going to push the Wade-Davis bill through Congress. They are not fans of Lincoln's 10% plan. They think it's too lenient. They would like the president to appoint a provisional governor for each state. They would like the majority, not 10%, but the majority of white males to pledge allegiance to the Union. After that, they said they would then be allowed to call for state constitutional conventions. Delegates would be elected, but only by voters who had never fought for the Confederacy, which in the South is a big ask. The Wade-Davis bill said that new constitutions would have to abolish slavery, would have to take the right to vote away from Confederate leaders, and they would have to repudiate war debts. Congress, after that, would then decide whether or not they would readmit those states to the Union. There is voting, suffrage rights, that is missing here. Think about for newly freed slaves. So think about other things that you think might be missing. Lincoln is going to block the Wade-Davis bill by using a pocket veto. He simply thinks that this is too extreme and that this is not the way he believes to bring the country back together. Lincoln will die on April 15, 1865, and the future of Reconstruction will be changed forever.
It's hard to believe that Lincoln not only saw John Wilkes Booth perform in a play, but saw him at Ford's Theater, which would become the scene of Booth's final act, which was and Lincoln's final act, the assassination. Lincoln went to Ford's just a few days before delivering the Gettysburg Address. He was in the midst of writing it, and he loved the theater, so he had an opportunity to see John Wilkes Booth in a turgid French play that had been translated called The Marble Heart. And John Wilkes Booth played the villain. And during the play, every time he had something villainous to say, he would direct it up at the presidential box. And finally, someone who was with Lincoln said, "He almost seems to be reciting those lines to you." And Lincoln said, "He does talk very sharp at me, doesn't he? Very sharp." John Wilkes Booth always wanted to do something really grandiose. He once thought of kidnapping Lincoln in a theater and lowering him to the stage from his balcony box. He was deluded into thinking no one would interfere. So on Inauguration Day, March 4th, 1865, he positioned himself behind stanchions in the Capitol Rotunda, waited for Lincoln to come out of the Senate chamber, which in those days was the site of the swearing in of the vice president, heading out toward the portico to deliver his great second inaugural. And according to one eyewitness, he sort of lunged beyond the stanchions with what the person who stopped him said was a crazed look in his eyes. That was a moment that he might have shot Lincoln. Lincoln went on to deliver the speech from the portico. If you look at some of the photographs, you can see John Wilkes Booth up in an upper balcony, watching, wearing a top hat. So I think it's possible he may have thought of doing something even there. So murder was on his mind for quite a few weeks. Lincoln delivered a well-promoted in advance speech from a White House window on April 11th, 1865. Booth and one of his co-conspirators, there are two different versions of who was with him, Lewis Powell or David Harold, one of them was with him. And Lincoln gave a rather long and tedious speech, not his most inspiring effort. It's too bad it was his final speech, as it turned out. And in the speech, he said, "The time has come to give the elective franchise to the colored man," he said, "to the very intelligent and those who serve in the army." It sounds today like means testing or limiting the vote, but in fact, at that moment, Lincoln becomes the first president ever to propose the franchise for African Americans, men, of course. And Booth is there, and either then or right after that turns to one of the conspirators and says, "That's the last speech you'll ever make." According to one witness, he said that means Negro equality. He doesn't use the word Negro. And he made good on his word just 3 nights later. The advertisements for Our American Cousin, the special benefit performance on Good Friday, 1865, announced that Lincoln would be accompanied by General Grant. Booth believed he could kill both of them, and his plan was to dismember the Union government. Mrs. Grant did not want to spend the evening with Mary Lincoln. They had been together in separate boats at City Point, Virginia, just a few weeks before. Mary, as usual, made life difficult. She wouldn't go to see Mrs. Grant until Mrs. Grant came to see her. She wouldn't go to Mrs. Grant's lunch. She did her own rival lunch. It went back and forth. It was not a match made in heaven. So Mrs. Grant and the general invented a great alternative. They would go up to Long Branch, New Jersey, to visit their children whom they hadn't seen for a long time. And that was the excuse they gave the White House. Otherwise, Grant would have either done one of two things: become the victim of John Wilkes Booth or stop the assassination. And it's something he regretted for the rest of his life because he was in pretty good shape. He thought he could have prevented it. There are many blood relics from the assassination, including the dress worn by the actress in the play, Laura Keene, very famous actress at the time. She rushed up to the box in her gown and was said to have cradled Lincoln's head on her lap while the doctors who were in the audience and who were helping decided what to do with him. And later, she emerged, after Lincoln had been taken across the street to die, she emerged with a blood-stained dress, which later went on tour with her. Wherever she went, there was an exhibition of her blood-stained dress. The truth is, Lincoln didn't bleed very much. In fact, to get technical about it, he had a compressed wound, and doctors had to stick their fingers in the wound to, to release his lungs so that he could breathe again. I mean, he was going to die. They knew that right away. But very little blood shed at all. However, when Booth had finished shooting Lincoln, Major Henry Rathbone, who was in the box that night, accompanying the daughter of a New York United States senator, stood up and tried to stop Booth from escaping. Booth had a Bowie knife and slashed at his arm and opened an artery. Rathbone bled all over the place. It was spurting, and nobody was paying attention to him because the president was lying on the floor of the box. It's his blood.
So after Lincoln is killed, Johnson becomes president. Johnson is pro-Union, but he is a Southerner and he is a Southern sympathizer. So he wanted to call his plan the Restoration Plan. It's a blend, if you will, of the Lincoln Plan and the Wade Davis Plan. He would appoint a provisional governor to each state, as in the Wade Davis bill. That governor would be in charge of inviting qualified voters to elect delegates to form a constitutional convention. States would have to revoke their ordinance of secession. They would have to abolish slavery, ratify the 13th Amendment, and repudiate war debts. They would have to do all of that in order to form this new constitution. But amnesty would be given for all Southerners who swore allegiance, except high-ranking officials. Frustration is growing as in the North as Southerners drag their feet with the abolition of slavery and suffrage for blacks. It just seems like there's never going to be any traction. Radicals refuse to recognize restoration governments, and they used their congressional power to take control of Reconstruction. So we're going to see some tension between Johnson and radical Republicans right off the bat. In December of 1865, Congress refuses to seat representative of restored governments. So those would be Southern governments who came back to the Union under the Restoration Plan of Andrew Johnson. Between 1865 and 1886, Southern legislatures passed something called Black Codes. This is an effort to, like I said before, continue the subjugation of freed slaves. Local officials can arrest unemployed African Americans, but it was also illegal for African Americans to have certain types of employment. They could fine blacks for vagrancy, so essentially standing around during the day with nothing to do. They could then hire them to private employers in order to, sort of like an indentured servitude. They could prevent African Americans from owning and leasing farms or working jobs other than what was considered slave jobs. So this is where we sort of have the introduction of the idea of sharecropping as an economic activity for freed blacks, freed slaves in the South. The congressional reaction to the Black Codes is to expand the Freedmen's Bureau, and in 1866 passed the Civil Rights Act, where blacks are declared to be citizens of the United States and allows the federal government to intervene in state affairs when it comes to matters of civil rights. Johnson's going to veto both of those items. Congress is going to override both of those vetoes. So again, tension between the president and the Congress. Radicals will dominate both the House and the Senate and will pass 3 Reconstruction bills in the early 1867. There will be override vetoes on all 3. Tennessee will be admitted to the Union after ratifying the 14th Amendment. Lincoln and Johnson governments of the other Confederate states are rejected. So if it doesn't fit within this radical idea of Reconstruction, those states are no longer considered to be back in the fold, so to speak. The Radical Reconstruction Plan also establishes 5 military districts, and in the bottom right there you can see all 5. Well, I guess that's not super helpful, but you can see the 5 districts. So the military is going to be sent in to make sure that Reconstruction is happening the way the radical Republicans believe that it should be happening. They're also in charge of registering qualified voters. The voters would elect constitutional conventions. Those constitutions had to guarantee black suffrage, ratify the 14th Amendment, and Congress then had to approve the new Constitution. Anyone born or naturalized in the United States is automatically a citizen. Representatives shall be apportioned among the states, counting the whole number of persons in each state. 3, excluding Native Americans. 3, no one can hold federal office if they took an oath of loyalty to the Confederacy. And 4, the U.S. must pay any debts incurred by the federal government. Congress will add the ratification of the 15th Amendment as another condition for admittance to the Union. Which is the right of citizens by the U.S. to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Remember, I said that there's a lot of tension between Johnson and the radical Republicans in office. When Johnson becomes president, he inherits a cabinet that isn't his own. It's Lincoln's cabinet. At the time, there was something called the Tenure of Office Act, which said that the president is not allowed to remove officials without Senate consent. And Johnson wants to fire Edwin Stanton. Edwin Stanton is a radical Republican. There's also something called the Command of the Army Act, where the president can only issue orders through commanding generals of the Army, President Grant, who can also only be removed with the consent of the Senate. And also there's something called ex parte Milligan. Military tribunals are unconstitutional if there are regular civil courts available. Okay, these are all important to understand in the context of Andrew Johnson in the Congress. So essentially, Johnson fires Stanton, and he nominates a man named General Thomas to become Secretary of War. And because of that, he has violated the Tenure of Office Act. It was important for him to put somebody in place that he felt he could trust and that he felt agreed with him in his policies. He wanted his policies carried out over Congress's policies. In violation of the Tenure of Office Act, he is impeached. Now, impeachment, as we know from recent history, does not mean that you are removed from office. It means you're going to be put on trial to see if you're going to get removed from office. And Johnson is found not guilty, right? Essentially, he is allowed to stay in office, but only by a single vote. In part 2, we will talk more about Reconstruction.